The Crimson Ridge. The morning Elara stepped off the stagecoach, grief was already waiting for her. The wind never stopped talking on the Arizona plateau. It scraped across the open land like it had something to say to anyone brave enough to listen. Elara felt it the moment her boots touched the dirt. She had traveled 2,000 miles for a future she believed in with her whole heart. She had crossed plains, rivers, and endless sky carrying a folded letter, a plain gold wedding band, and the promise of a life she had never seen. She expected a man to be waiting. Instead, she found silence, pity, and a grave. The year was 1878. 6 weeks earlier, Elara Vance had left Richmond behind on a rattling train, her past shrinking with every mile west. The war had taken her father. Debt had taken the family home. Her teaching position was gone. What the letters from Julian Thorne had felt like was a lifeline. He wrote of Arizona as a place where hard work mattered more than pedigree, where a woman could be a partner instead of a shadow. He did not want a servant or a cook. He wanted an equal. That promise carried her across the country. The stagecoach creaked to a stop in the tiny settlement of Dusty Knolls. The driver swung the door open and called the last stop. Elara was the only passenger left. She stepped down carefully, her boots sinking into the dry earth, and looked around for the man she was meant to marry. No one waved. No one smiled. The town was smaller than she imagined. One dusty street, a trading post, a saloon with warm bat-wing doors, a half-finished hotel, a small church leaning under a crooked steeple. Elara asked the driver where she could find Julian Thorne of Crimson Ridge. The man paused with her trunk in his hands and looked at her with something close to sorrow. He told her to see the sheriff. That was when fear took root. The sheriff's office was a simple plank building with a wooden star swinging from the porch. Inside, Sheriff Silas Reed looked up from his desk the moment Elara stepped in. He already knew her name. He asked her to sit. She stayed standing. Her heart knew the truth before her ears heard it. 3 days earlier, Julian Thorne and 2 other ranchers had been ambushed while driving cattle to market. None of them survived. A cavalry patrol found the bodies. The funeral would be the next morning. Elara did not cry. She could not. The words felt unreal, like they belonged to someone else. Yet she had crossed half a continent to marry a man she had never seen. And now she was being told he was dead. The letters she had read and reread until the paper softened in her hands were all that remained of him. The sheriff offered her a room at the hotel and a seat on the next stage back east. Elara sat down then, her strength giving way. Back east meant nothing. She had sold everything to come west. There was no home waiting for her there. She asked what would happen to Crimson Ridge. The sheriff told her the bank would likely take it. Julian had no family nearby. Without a will or a marriage certificate, the law would not recognize her claim. Elara listened quietly, her fingers wrapped tight around the last letter he had written. In it, he promised her a life and asked her to trust him. Something inside her hardened. She asked to see the ranch. The next morning, Dusty Knolls gathered on a low hill overlooking town. 3 fresh graves waited under the open sky. Elara stood apart from the crowd, mourning a man she had never touched, but somehow already lost. She felt the weight of what might have been pressing down on her chest. After the service, a woman named Martha Gale approached her. Her husband had been killed in the same ambush. Martha spoke plainly, and without self-pity. She told Elara that this land tested everyone who came to it, but it rewarded those who stayed. Those words followed Elara all the way back to the hotel. That night she sat on the narrow bed under the dim glow of an oil lamp and reread Julian's letters. He described Crimson Creek cutting through green pasture, a log cabin built with his own hands, and a future shaped by work and shared purpose. He wrote that he wanted a woman with backbone and sense, not a housekeeper, a partner. By dawn, Elara knew she was not ready to leave. 2 days later, the sheriff drove her out to Crimson Ridge. The land opened up before them as they crested a low rise. A bright creek wound through a wide valley. Cottonwoods lined the banks. A sturdy cabin sat near the water with a small barn and corral nearby. Cattle grazed in the distance, unaware that their owner was gone. Elara's breath caught. It was more beautiful than the letters ever said. The signs of sudden absence were everywhere. A bucket left by the door, firewood stacked neatly. A chair angled on the porch to catch the sun. Inside, the cabin was clean and solid. A wide hearth, a heavy table, shelves lined with books and supplies. Just on the desk lay a ledger, filled with careful numbers and plans. The last entry mentioned buying white paint for the cabin trim and noted her arrival date. Julian had been ready for her. Elara closed the book and felt the decision settle deep in her bones. She told the sheriff she was staying. He warned her that the territory was dangerous, especially for a woman alone. He spoke of outlaws and winter, and the hard truth of ranch work. Elara listened, then told him she could read, write, keep accounts, and hire help. She told him she had crossed 2,000 miles on a promise and would not walk away from it now. The sheriff shook his head, but did not stop her. That first night alone at Crimson Ridge, Elara slept little. The wind moved through the cottonwoods, and coyotes called from the hills. At dawn, she stepped outside and breathed in the sharp, clean air. Julian's horse waited in the corral. She fed him, clumsy but determined. Inside the barn, she found tools, a wagon, and firearms Julian had kept for protection. By midday, neighbors rode in. A woman named Sarah Flint and her son came to offer help. They spoke honestly, warning Elara that ranching was no simple thing. Elara did not pretend otherwise. She told them she would learn. Sarah saw the resolve behind her words and agreed to help her gather the scattered cattle. The work was harder than anything Elara had known. She learned to sit a horse the Western way. She fell. She bruised. She got back up. By sunset, they had brought most of the herd home. That evening, as the sky burned gold over Crimson Creek, Elara stood on the porch and looked out over the land. She had come west to become a wife. Instead, she stood on the edge of becoming something else entirely. She did not know what dangers lay ahead. She did not know if the law would stand with her, but she knew one thing with absolute clarity. She was not leaving. Crimson Ridge would not be abandoned. Neither would she. The days after Elara decided to stay did not slow down or soften. They pressed in harder, as if the land itself wanted to test whether her resolve was real. Elara woke before sunrise every morning. The cabin was quiet except for the wind brushing the walls and the soft creak of wood settling in the cold. She learned the shape of the place by heart, where the floorboard groaned, which window caught the morning light, how the creak sounded different after rain. This was no longer a stop along the way. It was home, and whether she was ready or not, Sarah Flint returned with her son and a young ranch hand named Caleb Moss. Caleb had worked for Julian the previous season. He was barely 18, freckled, quiet, and capable. When Elara asked if he would stay on, he agreed without hesitation. Julian had treated him fair, and that mattered in this country. Together, they began the work of holding Crimson Ridge together. They rode the range to gather cattle that had drifted after Julian's death. Elara followed more than she led, watching how Caleb moved his horse, how Sarah read the land. Her muscles burned, her hands blistered. She said little and learned fast. By the end of the week, she could ride without fear and dismount without stumbling. Branding day came sooner than she expected. The smell of burning hair turned her stomach, but Sarah told her plain that an unmarked calf was a dead calf in Arizona. Rustlers did not bother with brands they could be traced to. Elara kept the fire hot and the irons ready, her jaw tight as the calves bawled and kicked. By sundown, every new calf carried Crimson Ridge's mark. That night, Elara slept hard for the first time since arriving. The next morning brought trouble. A man rode in from the east, slow and confident, with two others trailing behind him. His clothes were finer than most ranchers wore, and his horse was well fed. He introduced himself as Sterling Vance, owner of the Iron Cross Ranch. His smile never reached his eyes. Vance offered condolences for Julian's death. Then he offered money. He said Crimson Ridge was too much for a woman alone. He said accidents happened out here. He said she would be wise to sell now and return east with a comfortable purse. Elara listened without interrupting, her hands folded in her lap. When she refused, his smile thinned. He left her with an offer and a warning. Wrapped together. 30 days. After that, he said, the land would decide. Sarah watched him ride away with a face carved from stone. She told Elara that Vance had been swallowing up smaller ranches for years. Men who refused to sell often lost cattle, fences, or worse. Nothing could ever be proven. Elara thanked her for the honesty. She did not sleep well that night. 2 days later, Elara found a letter hidden in Julian's desk. It was unfinished. In it, he wrote that Vance had been pressing him to sell, and that cattle had been turning up shot on the far pasture. He suspected hired men, but had no proof. The letter ended mid-sentence. Elara folded the page with shaking hands. Julian's death had not been random. She rode into Dusty Knolls the next morning to file her continuation claim on the homestead. The land office clerk looked at her papers with open doubt. She argued calmly, citing the law as she understood it. She presented Julian's letters and the sheriff's statement. The clerk agreed to forward the claim for review, but warned her it could be denied. It was not a victory, but it was ground gained. When Elara returned to Crimson Ridge, she found Caleb mending a fence along the eastern line that he told her riders had been seen nearby earlier that day. Men not from around Dusty Knolls. The warning proved true before the week was out. Elara and Caleb were repairing fence when 5 riders came hard across the open ground. Their clothes were worn, their weapons visible. Caleb recognized them instantly. Mordecai Black and his crew, known outlaws, men wanted for stage robberies and worse. They chased Elara and Caleb back to the ranch, firing as they rode. Bullets cracked past them, kicking up dirt. They barely made it into the barn before the doors slammed shut. Black did not bother hiding his intent. He told Elara she had 1 week to sell Crimson Ridge to Vance and leave. He said Julian had been given the same choice. He called murder a market correction. Then he rode away. Elara stood shaking in the barn long after the sound of hooves faded. Fear hit her hard, but anger burned hotter. Julian had been killed for refusing to sell his land. If she left now, his death would mean nothing. That night, Elara rode to the Flint Ranch. Sarah listened as Elara laid everything out. Black's threat, Vance's pressure, Julian's letter. When Elara finished, Sarah sat quiet for a long moment. Then she said what Elara already knew. If they did nothing, Vance would keep pushing. Black would return. They decided to set a trap. The sheriff agreed reluctantly. Without proof, Vance was untouchable. But if Black threatened Elara again with Vance present or named, they could act. The plan was dangerous. Elara would be bait. They spread a rumor through town that Elara had received money from back east and planned to expand Crimson Ridge. She bought supplies that supported the story. Everyone talked. Word traveled fast on the frontier. Vance took the bait. 4 days later, Black returned. This time, Vance rode with him. They arrived in the open yard. Confident and careless, Vance offered more money. Black threatened violence. Together, they laid out their terms in plain words. Sell or die. Hidden men heard everything. When the sheriff revealed himself, the yard erupted in gunfire. Black's men fell back, firing wildly. Vance tried to flee, but was thrown from his horse and captured. Black fought like a cornered animal. He dragged Vance in front of him as a shield and threatened to kill him if the law did not stand down. Elara watched from the side of the cabin, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it. Inside, the deputy lay wounded, but alive. Black's back was turned. Elara raised Julian's revolver. She did not think about Richmond or who she had been. She thought about the man who had built Crimson Ridge and the future stolen from him. She thought about the land she refused to surrender. She fired once. The bullet struck true. Black fell dead on the porch. When the smoke cleared, Vance was arrested, and the remaining outlaws were captured or fled. The sheriff told Elara it would be ruled justifiable. Black had been threatening lives. Elara sat alone on the porch afterward, the revolver resting in her lap. She felt no triumph, only a heavy calm. The cost had been high, but Crimson Ridge still stood. That night, under a sky crowded with stars, Elara made her choice final. She would stay. She would build, and no one would take Crimson Ridge from her again. The land did not change after the gunfight. But Elara did. In the days that followed, Crimson Ridge felt quieter than before, as if the valley itself was holding its breath. Blood had darkened the dirt near the porch. Broken boards scarred the barn. Those marks stayed for a while. Reminders of how close everything had come to ending. Elara scrubbed and repaired what she could, not to erase the memory, but to move forward. Sheriff Reed returned with deputies to finish the work. The wounded were tended. Black's body was taken away. Vance was hauled into town in irons, his fine coat dusty and torn. Word spread fast, not the wild version whispered in saloons, but the truth heard straight from the sheriff's mouth. Vance had hired killers. He had threatened lives. He had confessed. For the first time since Elara arrived in Arizona, the danger pulled back. A week later, Elara rode into Dusty Knolls alone. People stopped what they were doing to watch her pass. Some nodded, some tipped their hats, others simply stared. She was no longer the mail-order bride people had pitied. She was the woman who stood her ground when men tried to take it by force. Sheriff Reed met her outside his office. Inside, he poured coffee and handed her a folded document stamped with heavy seals. Her continuation claim had been approved. Crimson Ridge was legally hers as long as she completed the remaining requirements. Elara held the paper carefully, as if it might vanish if she gripped it too tight. It was not just land. It was proof that her fight had mattered. Vance's trial followed quickly with witnesses, his confession, and the sheriff's testimony. There was no escaping it. He was sentenced to territorial prison. The man who believed he could buy and bury anyone who stood in his way was gone from the valley for good. When Elara returned to Crimson Ridge, she found Sarah Flint waiting on the porch. "You did good," Sarah said simply. Elara nodded. She did not feel brave. She felt tired, but the work still waited. Summer settled in, and Crimson Ridge began to change. Elara hired another hand. Caleb stayed on, steady and loyal. Fences were repaired. The herd grew stronger. The garden expanded beyond anything Elara expected. She hauled produce into town and struck a deal with the trading post. For the first time, Crimson Ridge brought in steady money. Elara learned every inch of the land. She learned how to read the sky for weather, how to listen to cattle, how to spot trouble before it found her. She wore trousers now when she worked, practical and unashamed. People talked, but less than before. Martha Gale invited her to gatherings with other women. They shared food, work, and stories. No one treated Elara like a curiosity. She was one of them. At night, Elara still read Julian's letters. The ache never fully left, but it softened. She began to see that Crimson Ridge was no longer just his dream. It was hers now, too. 2 years passed. The final inspection came on a clear fall morning, and a land office official rode out with Sheriff Reed and walked the ranch from fence to fence. He checked improvements, records, and boundaries. Elara answered every question without hesitation. When he signed the final papers, Crimson Ridge became hers outright. Elara stood on the porch afterward, the patent warm in her hands, and let the moment settle. She had crossed 2,000 miles believing she would become a wife. Instead, she had become something she never imagined, a rancher, an owner, a woman who held her ground. As the sun dipped low, Gideon Flint rode up from the north. Over the years, their partnership had grown easy and strong. They shared grazing land, labor, and trust. Gideon respected Crimson Ridge as Elara's, never questioning her authority. He congratulated her quietly and sat beside her as the light faded. He spoke of the future, careful and honest, not promises, not pressure, just possibility. Elara listened. She did not answer right away. She looked out over the valley where Crimson Creek caught the last of the sun. The land that had tested her, broken her open, and rebuilt her stronger. Whatever came next would be her choice, made from strength, not fear. That night, lantern light glowed warm from the cabin windows. Elara stepped inside, closing the door on the past she had survived and opening herself to the life she had built. She had traveled 2,000 miles to marry a stranger. Instead, she found herself, and Crimson Ridge stood as proof that sometimes the future you lose is not the one that was meant for you at all. If you enjoyed this story of grit and the American frontier, please don't forget to share, like, and subscribe for more tales of the Old West. Would you like me to create a character